Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under licence. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
Okay, kia ora everyone, tēnā rau koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou ko taumaina I tēnei ahiahi. Kia ora everyone, I'm Sarah Jane and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the April Tōmaiora seminar today, and also my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Rachel Brown. Rachel's just successfully defended her PhD exam, but we'll probably hear a little bit more about that soon. I first met Rachel about 10 years ago, I think, when she was a group manager Māori at the HRC, and she was an advocate for Māori Health and an advocate for Māori students and postgraduate students. She was supportive and encouraging and insightful, and I think that is probably going to come through as part of her presentation today when she reflects on her learnings as part of her PhD research. Rachel's currently working at Whakauae, which is an iwi Māori Health research group. And we're extremely fortunate in our department that she's going to be joining us soon to support the responsiveness to Māori process that we offer here at the faculty. So it's a welcome to Rachel today as our guest speaker, and we're looking forward to hearing more about her PhD, but also a warm welcome to the faculty on behalf of the Tōmaiora Research Group. So thank you, Rachel. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. God, this is a bit nerve-wracking. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou. Ko taranaki te maunga, ko mōhaka tino te awa, ko parihaka te marae, ko te ati awa me Ngāi Tahu uku iwi, he kairanga hau ora taku mahi, ko Rachel hau. I think Sarah Jane's kind of said it all. So I'm Rachel, currently work for an iwi research centre based in Whānau, so I work remotely, and it's called Whakauae Research Services. And it's a real honour to be here, and I just want to give a shout out to all of you, but particularly to Ravi. It's so good to see you. Ravi and I started at the HRC on the same day, and he kind of worked out the system and did his PhD and toddled off and came here, so it's so nice to connect with you again. So thank you for being here, and also to Lorraine, who I haven't seen for ages, so thank you for coming. No pressure, she said that she's here to get inspiration. Just before I start though, can I ask, is anyone like writing a PhD, doing their masters? Lorraine, hand up. So what I'm hoping to do is also, as well as talk about my PhD topic, I want to incorporate my experiences with the subject, my own personal experience, but also my experiences as a PhD student. So hopefully you can learn off my mistakes, maybe. So as my thesis was entitled Surviving the System, Māori and Pacific Whānau Coping Strategies to Overcome Health System Barriers. So as it kind of says, I'll be looking at kind of the barriers, but also what I want to focus on is the coping strategies that Māori and Pacific whānau employed to get through the health system and the barriers that they came across. I just want to read something first. So this is part of my abstract that I put in. I had to really look back at what I was presenting. I thought, oh my God, I promised the world. Why didn't I just focus on one little thing? Yeah. And just say thank you to Mā Tere for letting me present today, or telling me to present today. So I just want to read this first. So the value, power and skill of Māori and Pacific whānau and their associated processes are often underestimated and undervalued within healthcare. However, collectively, whānau have the expertise and resources that can sustain them in daily life, and particularly when one of their members is under threat. Dealing with a child who has a life-threatening medical condition poses threat to whānau through premature death being imminent and whakapapa being interrupted. Healthcare engagement processes are critical and can either enhance or inhibit the whānau journey through the healthcare system. So I'm just going to leave that there, and I'll touch back in regards to that near the end. And I've got a million slides, but most of them are just pictures. And it feels funny talking for an hour. Never had that privilege before, suckers, you know. So why did I do this project? So it stemmed from our whānau's personal journey of our son being diagnosed with a cancerous brain tumour at age 7, then again at age 10. And while I had access to good resources, I had flexible employment opportunities, I was kind of set financially, so I could take significant time off. I had good family support and good knowledge of the health system, whatever that means. I barely coped. So when I looked around me when I was in Starship and I was at Ronald McDonald House for extensive periods of time, I saw majority of brown faces. And a lot of them didn't have access to the same resources. They didn't have immediate family support with them because they came from out of Auckland and actually out of New Zealand, a lot of them. So English was their second language. So in my head, I was like, if I have all these resources and all this support and I'm barely coping, how the hell, heck, being recorded, are these people coping? So that's what kind of swirled inside my head, or more my heart, I think. And that was my PhD question. So just on that, so I want to incorporate something. So on that learning, I wasn't going to incorporate my experience throughout my thesis. So what I want to say to you, if you have a chance to incorporate your experience in whatever you do, depending how you do it and how you're writing up for whatever you're doing, don't be afraid to incorporate it. And how that happened for me was another fun fact, don't be scared to ask for help. I did this too late in the process. 3 months before submitting, I asked someone for help. As in, I had my supervisors and they were great, but supervisors cannot meet all your needs. And we as students actually expect that for them to meet 100% of our needs, and they actually can't. So you have to look outside your supervisors for additional support. And I did that kind of too late in the piece. So I did things like join Maiki Tamaki, the emerging researchers group that Karen is running. You know, I kind of jumped onto Maiki Waikato. I looked on Facebook. I got support from people here, actually. People at the HRC, because I started my PhD when I was at the HRC. And so the support becomes really valuable. And they can't meet your needs 100% either, but the people within those groups do something. If you can get someone that's a little bit ahead of you, so if you're ready to do ethics or write your proposal, not looking at anyone, then find someone who's done that or is just a little bit ahead of you, and they can give you some pointers. And that's really, really valuable. All things I did not do, by the way, but I'm just telling you that's probably a good thing to do. So my supervisors, they got really busy. One was on her deathbed twice, and then one went into a huge new role. And, you know, so my PhD became, you know, less of a priority in their life. So you have to kind of expect that. Expect hiccups on your journey. Don't expect your supervisors to kind of, some are really, really good, don't get me wrong, but, you know, life happens. You know, your child gets a cancerous brain tumour, it kicks you in the ass, you know, and other people get sick. So I just want to throw that out there. So incorporating my experience into my PhD came by way of asking for feedback on chapters. And when I got feedback, someone said, oh, that's really good and well. I know about Starship, I know about high Māori and Pacific admissions, I know about Ronald McDonald House. Great, you've explained that, but what's your experience? I want to know, how long are you in there? What are the type of things you saw? How does it relate to your experience? And so I thought, oh, okay. And one of the things that my examiners commended me on was incorporating my experience and how I did that. So if you have the chance to do that, do it. And I just want to point out and give credit where it's due. The person who gave me feedback is Irina. So another fun fact is if you haven't got an Irina, get an Irina in your life. Not my Irina, because I need her. But even Irinas need Irinas. So Irina might be Karen at some point, Martin at some point, Elena at some point. So if you can find someone that you trust to give you feedback along the way, that you know will give you good sound advice in a loving way, then I suggest that you do that. Yeah, and Irina and I meet regularly, and I don't know anything about her topic. She's doing rongoa. But we banter, we have conversations which stimulates thinking, which stimulates the writing. So if you can get an Irina, Lorraine, get an Irina, it'll help. Join things like the groups that help stimulate your conversations. It really, really helps. And like I said, I didn't do this till 3 months before submission, and I wish I had done it earlier. Yep. So, what did I do? So I wanted to explore one, as I said, the coping mechanisms and strategies that Māori and Pacific whānau employed and when they were dealing with their child that has a life-threatening medical condition. So life-threatening for my research was around any condition that had at some point threatened the life of the child. So it included short-term, medium-term, long-term, terminal illnesses, and at the time of the research, the child could still have the condition. And the second objective was to look at the role and influence of Ronald McDonald House, Auckland, that is, on whānau coping. And the reason why is because I was there, and Māori and Pacific are the highest users of the Auckland-based houses. And at the time, there was no current empirical studies that explored how Ronald McDonald House impacted on the lives of whānau, or families. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to explore. I did use a paradigm net. So that's adapted by Denzin and Lincoln, and it also incorporated Mason Jury's research at the interface. What I liked about the paradigm net, and also Amohia Bolton used the paradigm net within her research. I really liked how the elements overlapped and interacted, and for me that is a reflection of Māori and Pacific diverse realities. That's a reflection of my life. My life doesn't go like this, it kind of goes like this. And I like that. And it also incorporated, it allowed for my background and my experience to be incorporated, my values to be incorporated within the research. And I could use lots of components at the same time, or I could pick and choose. They weren't kind of competing with each other, and I really liked that. So I used that. So I did qualitative mixed methods, as you could probably gather. I did 30 sets of interviews. So I did 20 sets of whānau interviews, Māori and Pacific whānau, and I did them as collectives and individuals. So they could choose whether they wanted to bring other whānau or they wanted to do it by themselves. I also did 10 sets of stakeholder interviews, and the stakeholders were recruited through whānau. So whānau would recommend people who had significantly supported them in their journey. So that's how they were recruited. And quantitative data was collected through Ronald McDonald House database and also the Ministry of Health National Minimum Data Set. And just let the quant enthusiasts know that this presentation is based on qualitative. So I originally went in to look at coping mechanisms and strategies, as I've already said, and what kind of whānau drew upon to cope in regards to their child that had this life-threatening medical condition. And so a definition of a coping mechanism for this research was something that was applied with minimal or conscious effort, or it was applied by default. And for strategy, a strategy was something that was deliberately implemented. So a mechanism might be crying or shutting down, or a strategy might be writing a journal, which people seem to do, and getting out of hospital, getting some exercise, that sort of thing. So something that was specifically put in place. Out of that, 3 kind of categories came out. So there were negative mechanisms and strategies, positive and protective. So, and they overlap. So while they overlap within, I kind of frame them in a holistic framework, while they overlap between the components, that also overlap between negative and positive. So for example, Whānau might identify smoking as negative or crying as negative, but they also might identify crying as positive. So just they can overlap. And the protective mechanism was mainly about protecting someone during the process, so not telling the child that they're about to have a blood test so they don't scare them. Or protecting Nana, not letting her see the booklet about the baby having open heart surgery because it'll freak her out or scare her. So it was putting in some protective mechanisms, and it was mainly around other people that they identified, although I think if I look back at my journey, I had some protective mechanisms for myself. So I'm just going to give you some examples of these, because just so you get the gist. So a spiritual mechanism might be feeling scared or a sense of loss or needing to find strength, and the strategy around that might be prayer, looking for meaning or a bigger purpose in regards to the situation, whether the child's really sick or dying or did die. And it might be around finding hope, having faith, and being grateful was a huge one. An environmental mechanism might be yearning for home, and wanting some familiarity around people around them, and strategies might be, so Whānau talked about going for a smoke, although they identified that as negative. The smokers area became a support group in itself, where they got information that they needed, they could ask questions and not be judged, and it was just a way to have a conversation and feel supported. And if I look back, I'm not a smoker, but I joined the smokers group quite a bit, and I knew, because they were out there at certain times, so I knew they would be out there after dinner with a coffee, and I'd go out there and I knew I could ask someone who had been somewhere or got some information and kind of get my questions answered. So a strategy would be, going for a smoke, bringing mementos from home. So people bought photos, and one whānau talked about connection. They needed to feel connected to home, so she bottled the water from her river, and she would wash her hands in it, or she'd just have it near her. And her quote was, "I bring my own awa with me." So I thought that was nice. And a psychological coping mechanism might be mistrust or powerlessness, and the strategy might be make a complaint, comply, don't ask questions, or take some form of control. So one whānau talked about when they were in the paediatric intensive care unit with their baby, the nurses took over their care, every single bit of their care, and one mother said, I had to go in there and reclaim my power as a parent. I just felt so redundant. And that does happen in intensive care units. I know parents that I was with, they felt redundant at times. So I came up with this lovely framework that was holistic, had over 100 mechanisms and strategies, and I was quite proud, thinking, done. And then I learnt my lesson, because I was like, and now what? And then I kind of thought, I need to relook at this data. And so, fun fact number whatever is, don't be scared to reanalyse your data, which is a good time to reiterate this. Let your data do the talking. So often we go in with preconceived ideas, and I hear people at different research meetings saying, I want to do this research, and they kind of already come out with an outcome, and I kind of laugh thinking, yeah, I did that too. But, there's always more. So one of the key findings is not about how whānau coped and the mechanisms and strategies that they drew upon. this actually became secondary to what they were actually coping with, and they were coping with other things in addition to their child being critically ill. So what I had to do is I needed to look at the circumstances, and half of you will know this already, beyond just the sick child, and look at the context of whānau coping in order to better understand what they were coping with. And so what I realised is that, and I already know this from my journey, but it was quite different seeing it over there rather than over here. So even before a child is diagnosed with a life-threatening medical condition, the lead up in dealing with the signs and symptoms of something being seriously wrong places enormous stress on whānau. So I just want to put this quote up while I read this. So, something is to be said about a woman's intuition and reading signs and symptoms, and no offence men, it's just that woman articulated they knew something was wrong. And men probably saw it too, but they didn't kind of tell me that. And so I remember telling someone, never deny your intuition about something. Because, you know, I think 9 times out of 10 when I think back to my son and other things in my life, it came from here. And the Māori have this thing about it coming from the puku and feeling it in there. So I just want to read you this. So whānau have explicit expectations when they enter a health system or their healthcare engagement. So they expect that it's going to be positive, they expect it's going to be straightforward, and they believe they're going to receive care at the time when they first present the child, and that their concerns are taken seriously and they will be treated with respect. So, as this quote says, so come November, after going to 4 different doctors, we were told that he has a virus, he has a tummy bug, here is some medication. I'd go back 3 days later and say it is not working. I was getting frustrated. I ended up taking him to emergency almost every second day towards the middle of November. I was starting to lose hope, as every time I went back to A&E, I knew very well I was going to get the same friggin' doctor and he will make the same diagnosis and will be sent home with Panadol. So the reality for many of my whānau was that the healthcare engagement was not straightforward, and there were issues, whether that was at the beginning, the middle or the end. So 6 of their whānau presented their child to various clinics and emergency departments and were sent away with pain relief, only to return on several occasions when the child's health had deteriorated. And, you know, how do you cope with that? Well, the whānau coped with getting second and third opinions. And one whānau talked about at their rural clinic going in, there was a locum there, fill-in doctor, he didn't even check the child and just came to the same conclusion as the ED doctor because he read the medical notes. So how people coped was second and third opinions, but also 4 of them made a scene to be seen, and that's how they coped. Regarding the child concerning the green quote, that child was diagnosed with cancer, and about 2 months later he passed away. And that whānau copes by a number of things, but what they have done is they set up a foundation for other whānau, not so much having the same issues with engagement, but to help others in rural communities with support, with information, and just being there as a support person. And if anyone's interested, that's called the Brooklyn Love Foundation, and it's set up by the Pātea whānau, Big in Touch, Pātea, Dominant Pātea. So it's his whānau. So whānau coped by reading signs and symptoms, listened to their intuition, they took action, whatever that was. They kept going back, they challenged systems, and they made a scene. The prospect that your child might die at any time puts whānau in survival mode. So that is, you do everything you can at that moment just to survive. Whānau routines become disrupted, radically disrupted, and everything becomes secondary to the child's health or ill health. So even whānau that were impacted by the Christchurch earthquakes, that meant nothing to them regarding their child's health. They'd lost their house, they didn't know where they were going to live, they weren't sure what was happening, and this was the February one where people had died. So that was all going on in the background, which shows you additional things that whānau have to cope with. But it became secondary. And a significant contribution to whānau disruption is that their care or treatment is not being undertaken locally, but at hospitals outside their region, and in some cases outside of their country. So that impacts on taking time off work. A lot of people had to leave work because treatment, depending on your cancer, takes months. And also, they're not with their familiar support systems and structures. So 15 of my 20 whānau lived outside of Auckland, and 4 out of the 15 lived outside of New Zealand. So they came from Samoa, Rarotonga, Australia. Most of the whānau talked about being ill-equipped and ill-prepared, physically, financially and emotionally. And particularly as all whānau admissions were a result of an emergency or emergency crisis. So if I think back to my journey, I went from GP, paediatrician, MRI, straight to Starship. I didn't go home for months, and I lived in Auckland. I never went back to my home for months. And while I had people to bring me stuff, you can never fathom what you would need on this journey. And sometimes it's the little things that you want or need. Can't even think of what I needed. So the location is pretty, it disrupts whānau processes where hospitals are based and where they have to have their treatment. So how did they cope? Basically, that quote says it all. Whānau will do what it takes. So they went into survival mode. For some whānau in the study, that meant travelling long distances, pooling resources, going without whatever, whether that meant food or accommodation because they couldn't afford it, or sleeping in their cars. And while whānau shouldn't have to sleep in their cars, whānau will do what it takes. And if you haven't got the money to get accommodation, and Ronald McDonald House, there's a whole referral process involved with that, with clinician sign-off or DHB sign-off, we will sleep in our cars. And actually that's not a problem for whānau, it's a problem for other people. So I just want to say that. I mean, I would do it, and in fact, I'll tell you that story later. So the other things they had to deal with is diverse realities and clash of worldviews. So being distanced from homelands and familiar support systems added to whānau pressures. Also, whānau coping was further compromised by different worldviews, diverse realities and experiences. So as you can see there, Western versus Māori, Māori Pacific, island-born versus New Zealand-born, traditional family structure, contemporary family structure, urban versus rural needs. There's a whole lot of things there that, whānau have to contend with. And we all have to try and fit into this one system. So they drew on what they had, what they knew, and what they could access. And I'll go into that later. So back to the PhD. And speaking of data, so I had a love-hate relationship with my data. At times it made me angry, at times it made me sad, and then at other times it gave me hope and got me excited. I actually had a meltdown near the end. I just thought, there's no hope. But then there's always hope. So my friend sent me a TED talk on how one of the Gisborne tribes were taken to the Chatham Islands and were left there to die, and how they, some of their whānau did die there, but they got together, they kind of took over the boat and they took all their bones and everything back home. And he sent me that and I was like, what the hell? But actually what I saw what he was doing is that there's always hope when you think there's no hope. So yeah, it was a love or hate relationship. It still is sometimes. I also found that certain things would influence how I wrote up my analysis. So quite heavy things happened during my PhD. My auntie died, my niece committed suicide, my brother-in-law, who was very close to, died, my son got sick again. I went through separation and divorce, apparently not uncommon in our situation, and I sold my house. So I basically did everything, but probably didn't get married and didn't get pregnant. But so all that would have influenced how I looked at data and how I wrote this thing up. So I realised I needed to get into a space where I was giving the data my best, or the best that I had at the time. So what I've learnt is make boundaries. So don't be scared to make boundaries. So I did things like I deactivated Facebook because a lot of the things that were coming up were influencing me personally and professionally. So I was comparing myself to other PhD students who had submitted, who had started after me. And so I was freaking out and feeling the pressure. So don't do that. Do what it takes to put boundaries in place. What else did I do? So yeah, so your journey is your journey, and your journey is different to someone else's, so don't go comparing yourself. It's just not worth it. They have different issues, they have different environments that they have to work in. And why I say that is because I went to this writing workshop the other day, and 6 people out of 20 there had submitted their PhD, and my God, they looked so fresh, and I looked exhausted compared to them, and I said to them, you know, how come you look fresh and I look like this and I feel like this? And then when they started talking, I realised, you don't have children. You haven't sold your house. You didn't go, you know, so your journey is your journey. So it's not good to compare, so just don't do it. I also limited contact with certain people. You know, there's certain people in your life that are so negative and draining, bloodsuckers I call them. I think, oh my God. So I had to put boundaries in place. And sometimes I just hid and locked my house and pretended I wasn't home in my pyjamas with my dirty cats. Or I'd go somewhere else to write. And you know, sometimes Edina says to me, can I come and write at your house? Sometimes you need a different environment. So try that. Try everything to try and get your head into a space where it works. The other thing I learned is sometimes the closest to us have the least compassion and understanding. I'm talking about my family, you know, and people that have been through the journey, they're really good. So my family would go, finish that PhD yet? Yeah, doctor yet? Oh God, he's still doing it. He's still writing. Oh, I'm going to get a real job, you know. But people, like, I remember going to a meeting with Donna and Bridget, Masters Awatiri, and I was in Whānau, and I sat there and I was writing up the end of my PhD, and I don't know, I think I had to welcome you or do something. So I talked a little bit about myself, which they already knew who I was, but went on a bit. And at the end of the meeting, Donna quietly said, I noticed you didn't say anything about your PhD. Do we ask? You know, so she knew, don't ask the question, because actually that becomes kind of something in your head that goes, oh no, are they going to ask me about my PhD? So people who've been through it won't ask you that. I don't think, Mātiri, you asked me once, which is great. Yeah, because you get sick of that question, because it's just more pressure. So don't expect everyone to understand and understand what it takes. So I suppose the learning for that is I took some control so I could focus. I limited my own barriers and distractions to writing and analysis. And doing so, I was able to delve a bit deeper. Which leads me to this other bit. Just put my pages back together. So, oh, Donna, you're like this, I think. So, when I went a bit deeper into my data, so this is what I found. So what they were coping with were also, in addition to their child, who was critically ill, could die at any time, was the barriers and distractions, these barriers and distractions. And I found them over 4 areas: policies and procedures, people and practice, resources and environment. And then I boxed them in these nice little boxes. And you can see where racism is in a nice tidy little corner hidden on the right. So I thought, oh, that's nice. Donna would be proud. So then I thought, I reanalysed my data. I looked at my data further, whatever you do, I don't know the terminology, but I just kept looking at the data. And so then I came up with this. And as you see, racism has moved from hiding in the corner. And it's sitting loud and proud across these 4 areas. And when I looked at the data, it was just like in my face. And I've decided once you see racism, you can't unsee it. So, yeah, it becomes pretty prominent. So anyway, that's where that's at. So these all these barriers and distractions impacted on whānau. So they disrupted specific cultural mechanisms. They limited key support, as well as negatively impacting Māori and Pacific gender and generational roles, Māori and Pacific whānau structure and designated member functions. That all sounds a bit gibberish, but I'll go into it. They also devalued, these barriers, the importance of collective support, including community. And also Māori and Pacific whānau processes such as hui, decision-making, karakia, and culturally appropriate care and communication. So I'm just going to give you some examples around some of these areas and show you how whānau cope through it. So policies and procedures, so there were inconsistencies in information as well as who gets the information. So inequitable access to resources. So there's a lot of gatekeeping going on. You know, people decide who will get what information, who gets the free parking permit and who doesn't, you know, for oncology, that sort of stuff. So not everyone was entitled to it, but not everyone got it. So there were also inconsistencies in information, not only in one DHB, but actually across DHBs. So one of the things was around travelling with a child, so people that had to come or go to different places. So a number of whānau went to up to 3 different locations before they came to Starship. So travelling with a child, whānau noted that in Wellington especially, they were really, really strict around only having 1 person. But actually, if you look at the National Travel Assistance Policy, you can have 2. There are conditions and there is a criteria. But when I look at the criteria, nearly everyone in my study met the criteria. But because whānau go into survival mode, the last thing you want to do is get clinician sign-off to get it approved, and you actually just do what it takes. And sometimes doing what it takes is just 1 person travelling. But that impacts on whānau. And here's a quote from someone that was the sole caregiver. So they say, it's absolutely horrific because you can't get away from the bedside and you need 2. 2 people need to be there, otherwise you can't get the rest, you can't get a proper meal, and you can't get sleep. When it's just me, it's double the load, 24/7 and doubly hard. And what that tells me, of course, there's things happening when there's only 1 person, but the strengths-based bit is that whānau can articulate what they need to stay healthy. So what do you see there? They need rest, they need meal, they need support, they need sleep. So whānau have the knowledge to know what they need, you know. So yeah, many whānau met the criteria for the National Travel Assistance. So for those that don't know what that is, that's assistance when people are travelling. So you can get, if you meet the criteria, you can get some money for accommodation, mileage, and there's some other things. It's currently under review. So whānau can access accommodation up to $100 per night per family. And while in a number of DHBs, that's fine. In Auckland, what whānau were telling me was that there is minimal quality accommodation for under $100 a night. And what Ronald McDonald tells me is that it costs them $120 a night to house a family for 1 night. And they have sponsorship deals. So it doesn't quite meet the need. But good thing is it's under review. So hopefully they one, get more information, get better information out there, and it's easier to access, and people are aware of how to access it. Second inconsistency is around family-centred care. So Starship prides itself on its family-centred care model, but there were, as I looked at lots of documents, I found lots of inconsistencies across Starship relating to different areas, wards and units. So this green quote is taken from the Paediatric Intensive Care Unit website, and as you can see, family-centred care is the dominant philosophy of the unit, and staff care for critically ill children in partnership with the child's family and whānau. So throughout Starship documents, they say family, whānau, they say parents/caregivers, so that implies they know what those terms mean. So I got quite excited about that, yay! And then I read on, and it keeps saying parents present at the bedside, parents. So while some progress has been made, I think we've got a little bit further to go. So it seems to revert back to the Western concept of a nuclear family. Yeah, so the more I reviewed, the more I kind of got angry in the worse it got. But I also want to show you what Ronald McDonald says. So they define their family as caregivers, parents, step-parents, grandparents, foster parents, aunts and uncles, brothers, sisters, half-brothers and sisters. So, you know, quite a great definition. And my, what's better than the hospital one, so my 3 years working with them, and also prior to that being with them, I saw this implemented from policy to practice. Yeah. And one other quote was that that's what whānau liked about Ronald McDonald House. So compared to the hospital, they didn't determine who your whānau were. So they liked that. And then just one of the other things, so the family-centred care policy within Starship, it's kind of contradicted by the one-parent rule, one-parent/caregiver rule, which is only one parent can stay overnight with the child. You know, when your kid could die at any time, so mine went into surgery, was due to go into surgery at 7 o'clock in the morning. We were told he had a 90% chance of coming out of that surgery. And, you know, saying only one parent can stay. That's huge pressure on the parent that's not there. And so how do whānau cope? Well, you know what I did? I broke the rules, and I said to my husband, because I certainly wasn't going anywhere, no, you're going to stay here and we'll deal with it when it comes up. We didn't have to deal with it, but the backup plan was he'd sleep in the car, so he's near. In case anything happened, I mean, it's huge pressure on whānau when that happens. Others relied on family and friends, researched information around accommodation, other people, other families supported families. So we ended up supporting families to either pay for them financially to stay near if they couldn't get into Ronald McDonald House because it was full, or, you know, they could use our house, or their family could use our house. You just become kind of, you just give support and then it gets reciprocated. And I just want to talk about cultural models of care. So there are cultural models of care out there, and, you know, while their intentions are great, and I think, I'll read what I wrote, it might be easier. So cultural models that are developed within a Māori and Pacific context, driven by cultural values, traditions and practices, are done so with the very best intentions. However, what fails to be accounted for is that such models are often taken out of their original context, applied in a Western system, such as a hospital or organisation, where cultural elements are redefined to fit with Western ideals and understandings, family versus whānau, parents versus caregivers, and become implemented according to Western values. While intentions seem reasonable, they lack cultural reinforcement and understanding. A lack of a culturally reflective workforce and or cultural competence of the current workforce then bastardizes these models even further, to the point where they become tokenistic, having very little real value and reducing disparities for Māori and Pacific whānau. So when I did a chapter in my thesis around the models, different cultural models, and then I thought, well, these are great. What's happening? Why are we still, not getting very far? And then when I re-looked at my data, this is why. Well, it's kind of common sense really now. If you take something out of its cultural context, you reshape it and try and redefine it. And I think of whānau order in these spaces, and you don't have the cultural means to back it up or to implement it, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. So communication, really related to the how, what, where, who, when, what is said, and associated behaviours and the impact. So how information was relayed, what was relayed, where it was relayed, who was it relayed to, and how. So how. Usually information was communicated very quickly from doctors, and usually at a time of high stress. I think of our hospital transfers project, and when you're in intensive care and you just walk in and you get bombarded with all this information, that's kind of what happens. It uses technical language, foreign terminology. So one of the quotes said, they used all these words like evidence-based and clinical trials, which we kind of use in everyday life now as researchers, but for whānau it means nothing. Confusing terms like oncologist versus hematologist versus neurologist versus neurosurgeon. It's just all confusing noise at the time. And it's usually blurted out in the hallway about cancers or tumours. Written information was confusing or unappealing. A lot of people talk about the chemo book, which I laugh because I remember getting this when we first went into chemo. And while now, I just read it before actually, and I thought, I actually understand this. But at the time, you know what I did? I handed it to my mother, who was a nurse, and I said, tell me what I need to know, because this is just like, I don't want to read this. And while it had a few Māori words on it that I just realised now, and a few koru patterns, it's unappealing. But actually, I can make sense of it now, which is another thing that I'll talk about later on. So whānau talked about three whānau only talked about being told information in a private room. Others were told at the bedside and in the corridor. And who was it communicated to? Mostly whoever was around. But in saying that, Pacific whānau especially, and Māori, but mainly Pacific, talked about the lines of communication within their family. So for instance, if you're my husband's Cook Island, from a traditional Cook Island family, if his mum went into hospital, it would be the sister that looked after the mother and did the lines of communication. If it was the father, it would be my husband or one of the brothers. It's, I think, there's gender roles around that, and sometimes it's around being the oldest child, sometimes it's around who has the most medical knowledge. It just depends, but there seems to be a line of communication which is set up by the family, but of course it's very seldom used by clinicians. Sometimes, like I think one or two whānau did say, the doctor did say, well, who do I talk to, or I'll come and talk to your whole family, but it certainly wasn't common, and those with English as a second language, of course, then had to translate information and then had very limited medical knowledge, so had to kind of use their own limited interpretation of that medical knowledge to pass on to other family. And also felt a pressure with that, because family would get angry at the diagnosis and what's happening now and what do we do, and so they felt the pressure of being that spokesperson. And also around communication was around men and grandparents were often left out of health discussions despite being present. And there's quite a few things around Pacific men which was interesting, but I'll just touch on that. Also, grandparents who were primary caregivers found it difficult, as in a cultural context, they had all the rights to make decisions around their child, and actually the whānau. But within the health system, they have no legal rights to make critical health decisions for their child that they've had for 10 years. So that was really difficult. And there's a quote here around how this sort of thing disrupts whānau processes. So my grandson was really bad. It looked like they would need to do an operation as he was going downhill fast. And we were in the hospital, and they said that our next step is surgery. I was texting my daughter madly because they needed her authority. They said to me, "You can't give it, we need it from a parent." I was trying to find her, I couldn't find her, and I was thinking, this just can't happen again. I was not wanting to do a legal process. I didn't want to go through the courts and get legal custody of him. As a whānau, we can do this and we can sort it out ourselves. But that incident forced me to go through a court process. So that quote to me describes the emotional anguish whānau felt and being forced into positions that culturally disrupt their whānau processes. And other whānau relayed other experiences where the system didn't cater for grandparents to visit outside of visiting hours, and highlighted that while in some instances they were allowed to see their dying grandchild, it had to be constantly negotiated, alongside the use of cultural mechanisms that they brought with them, such as karakia or waiata or just being present. Grandparents do a lot. Grandparents have a presence that actually do something for the child. Yeah, certainly my parents had a big impact, and if I think back to these whānau, half of them were grandparents who were primary caregivers, but also other whānau, grandparents do something. They have this presence and this calmness, I think, and this ability to look after the other children and make sure you're fed. It's wonderful. So we've talked about location, a bit about the culture and the clash of worldviews, but also about the design. So the design of hospitals is not conducive to meeting whānau needs. So waiting areas are often small and over-occupied, and whānau spill out into corridors, which irritate staff. You know, you get told to go wait in the whānau room or the waiting room. It's a two-seater couch with 10 people trying to fit in this room, you know. Patients are told private and pertinent information in public spaces, corridors and bedsides, so there's limited meeting spaces. And when I talk to stakeholders about that, they're like, no, there's meeting spaces. And I go, so if I wanted to book a meeting, how do I do that? She says, oh, you have to book through me, and then we go through the system. But a lot of the time, as you will all probably know, doctors' rounds aren't set. They may be set for between 7 and 8, but you can't kind of dictate or a time and so book a room for it. I suppose you could ahead of time, but you know, sometimes the doctors' rounds don't happen. And as this picture shows, and I took this picture because I needed some space when I was told something, and I saw a whānau room, and I went to open it, and then I read the sign. It's like, please keep the door locked. So while the DHB can quickly say, we have whānau designated spaces, they're not conducive to our needs. We can't even get into them, you know. The other thing around design is parking is expensive, and street parking around Starship is time limited and very heavily monitored. People talked about getting fines, paying parking $800 over a few, maybe a month or a couple of weeks, so that's huge. Supermarkets, so remember people fly in, they're not usually Auckland based or in my thing. Supermarkets are a 25-minute walk and place in expensive suburbs, Newmarket, and in the CBD, and also access to them. A good thing is Ronald McDonald's has shuttle runs 3 times a week that takes you to a supermarket, but you have to be residing there. So how do people cope? So you know, they became resourceful and they utilised other spaces. So Ronald McDonald has meeting rooms, so they became resourceful in using that. Other cafes, they found out that the barrier arm goes up after a certain time, and so you can actually get out for free. You know, they share free parking permits. I don't know if you can still do that. We did, we shared ours. I don't know, they probably have a system now. I haven't needed one for a long time where they kind of stop that. But you know, you do what it takes. anything else. And then the last one is services and information. So there's a general lack of transparency of information, both pointing to services and within services. So whānau not knowing about different services. So for example, a lot of whānau that either come out from different countries or come from out of Auckland, they need WIN support for benefits, or they need housing support, depending how long they're there. Now the whānau I talked to, most of them that needed that, made an appointment, waited 2 weeks, went to Henderson office for some reason, and then were either denied or sent back to hospital to get sign-off. Now what one whānau told me is that WIN sits in Starship outpatients 3 days a week. No one else knew that. I mean, where is that information? And then I tried to look it up. WIN's at Starship. Nothing. They just pointed you to local. So, I mean, the lack of transparency around that, that's really important for whānau, the WIN's information. And then some of these services, even though they were quite good and they're found to be facilitators of whānau coping, they were limited and had gaps. So one whānau talked about not knowing what one service provides. So the support worker said, let me know what you need. And so she was saying, well, what do you supply? You know, other than support being here at my bedside, what else do you actually supply? And she said she asked 3 times and didn't really get a concrete answer. But what she found out later is they supplied petrol vouchers, supermarket vouchers. You know, they had a library where you could access DVDs for your child. I mean, the playrooms also have that in Starship, but this was additional. They had a washing machine where you could wash your clothes and dry them for free down the road, but didn't really promote that information, and I don't know what that's about, you know. Well, I could say, but, you know. So services were found on one hand to facilitate whānau coping and on the other hand to provide further barriers for whānau through their limitations and gaps. So things like only available 9 to 5. 9 to 5 in a hospital when your child is critically ill is the busiest time on earth. I had OT, physio, speech language therapy, the doctors come around, the neurosurgeon coming back in, and you just don't get, it's just an additional pressure to have the service come. And so also workers were spread far and wide, so you were on waiting list, or they'd come and they wouldn't really provide support, and then they'd come back 2 weeks later because they were so stretched. Also, I just wanted to point out with the interpreting services also there were issues in accessing them. So 2 whānau said that they needed interpreting services, and while on the website it says it's 24-hour service, that kind of never happened. And when I looked at what you had to do to get it, or clinicians accessing it, oh God, it was such a process. So, you know, if someone presented to emergency and needed interpreting services and you had to go through all this process, so, you know, whānau kind of filled the gap, so they would interpret for others. Like my husband interpreted some of this for a Cook Island family that was flown in around the risk of infection because a mother came in with 3 children and one was coughing. So when you're having chemo, you know, my son's immune system is compromised. So the last thing you want is someone sick in there. And this little boy was coughing, and the doctor was telling her about this beautiful chemo book that they must have just designed, and she was nodding. And I said to my husband, do you think she understood any of that? And he told her about the risk of infection, and he went, no. And I said, well, I'm going to go out and see if this book's in any other languages. Went to the receptionist, said, is this book in any other languages? And the receptionist looked at me horribly and went, no. And so I went back to my husband, found the page, and said, you need to interpret that because I can't compromise my son's health or our son's health with that. And he was highly embarrassed, but he did it. And she was highly embarrassed because she didn't understand. Interpreter would have kind of helped that situation, or knowing that someone's going to fly in from the Cook Islands or somewhere might indicate that, you know, the service might be needed. And I just want to touch on cultural support. That was a mixed bag. Some whānau found it really, really helpful. I personally didn't expect, I had a negative experience with cultural support. I interviewed them and I found that they were overworked, under-resourced. I also found that originally they were part of teams within the wards, multidisciplinary teams. They were dedicated, they had dedicated wards, so they knew whānau were coming in, they kind of knew what their issues were, or would see them kind of up front rather than later on. Staff that had left were replaced, so the cultural support for Starship went down from 5 to 1 person, and she also supplies the cultural support for Ronald McDonald House. And now they're kind of tucked away in the corner and they receive information by fax, so they don't have any kind of pre-contact with ward staff unless they have to. And what we found is other whānau that had negative experiences, cultural support were called in as a security measure. You know, you're only supposed to have 2 whānau, you've got 4, tell them to go. Or they're too noisy, can you come in and tell them to go? So there was a mixed bag of reactions to cultural support, but when I interviewed them, I could see, you know, they were under-resourced, overworked, and just undervalued. So how do whānau cope? So whānau filled the gap. So again, they pooling resources, supporting other whānau and staff by providing cultural advice and interpretation. They were there 24/7, they supported others, they become advocates for each other, they supplied critical information and support, and they searched for the familiar. So what happens is, if you've got no immediate support, you're in a ward and there's hardly any other brown faces, you usually go searching for other whānau, and I did that. Ronald McDonald House has a thing on the board with all the whānau, and I'd look at the names every day and go, oh, Māori whānau, oh yeah, I might know one of them. And I'd go and actively say hello, because I'd been in there a while, and I could kind of offer them some support or advice. Well, don't do this, make sure you get your parking permit. The barrier arm goes up at 11 o'clock, make sure you get your car out. And that's what other whānau did. They searched for the familiar, similar cultural, values, similar cultures, even those that weren't brought up in kind of a traditional, cultural kind of family. They knew that when they were in an environment that was foreign and that were people that weren't the same as you, they went searching for it. And a lot of those people that they found were receptionists that had been at their jobs for a long time and knew all the processes and the resources, and the cleaners. Very good support, the cleaners. Very knowledgeable, and usually the only very few brown faces on the ward apart from patients. So that was interesting. And just in regards to information, just quickly, whānau identified information needing to be reinforced at different times and through different means due to stress, shock and exhaustion. So they identified they wanted hard copy information, they wanted people to also talk to them, and they were happy to have electronic information, but they also wanted it available in different languages so they could understand it. I have no idea what the time is. Okay, so here we are. So here's my beautiful picture. So whānau go in and with the attention on their child, but what happens is they get caught up in all the barriers and distraction. It's a bit like Wonder Woman fighting off with you. And they take their attention off their child. So what happens is there's system-based resources like information, services, and they are facilitators, but they are limited. So whānau initiate their own resources through a holistic framework. They look at coping mechanisms and strategies, but most of all they fill the gap. So they fill the gap that services, health systems and clinicians should be providing. So should I just read this last bit or should I leave it there? So that's quite a nice place to leave it. Yeah, I'll leave it there. So I don't know if that's helpful. Lorraine. I'll just read this last bit. So the value, power and skill of Māori and Pacific whānau and the associated processes are often underestimated and undervalued within healthcare. However, collectively whānau have the expertise and resources that can sustain them in daily life, and particularly when one of their members is under threat, which I've read before. So in my research, what I found is whānau exhibited amazing resourcefulness in drawing upon innovative and familiar strategies. And these are only some of them, because I promised the world and I had to touch on the world, to get their needs met. Searching for the familiar, utilising what they had at their disposal became, to get their needs met. Searching for the familiar, utilising what they had at their disposal became key to surviving the system. Cultural practices, processes and roles play a vital part in enhancing whānau coping, which I only touched a little bit on, but it was a real key part. Whānau was seen to provide practical solutions to system-based problems that not only affected vulnerable whānau, but their healthcare practitioners. Whānau know what they need to be and stay well, and on one level have the means to implement it, but it is the barriers, restrictions, racism, lack of resources and support at all levels of the health system and society that impinges on Māori and Pacific whānau benefiting from full participation. So, I'll leave it there. Thank you. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Questions? I might do just maybe one or two questions, and if anyone wants to maybe come and talk to Rachel after, if we've got time to have side convo. So does anyone have anything they want to ask? Got Annika?
Just a little one. Nui ki a koe. That was beautiful. Mine's a method, it starts to me with my anthropology course I on that was very ethnographic. Your research that you were coming from first-hand experience and the context which you were familiar with, and the observations you shared told more of a story than the kōrero. And I was wondering how much you emphasised that aspect of your PhD.
It was incorporated right through, actually. And actually my examiners did question to kind of, did this come from your observation or did it come from the whānau? And it was both, so yeah. And it was weaved actually quite, or woven quite intrinsically.
It's a beautiful ethnographic study, but yeah, very beautiful. She would showcase that. I think you might be underselling it.
Thank you. Actually, funny you should say that, because before I walked in I had a phone call from the CE, but I didn't answer it, so it'll be interesting to see what he has to say, because I gave him an interim report. So the whole second objective was around Ronald McDonald House. Look, compared to the hospital, and that's all I can compare it with, Ronald McDonald House is a positive influence for Māori and Pacific whānau, and it is a primary facilitator for whānau coping. They're not, they have a long way to go, and the CE, when I did this, he was really open. Like I said, what do you want out of this? He said, I just want to know what whānau need, how can we make the services better? You know, there's probably about 20 recommendations for Ronald McDonald House and how they can better their services. But they're open, and a lot of things have changed since I've done the research. So I had quite a bit of contact with Ronald McDonald House throughout. I was feeding back. So some of the things that we noticed was signs in different languages. They started doing that. Hiring more Māori and Pacific staff, they started doing that. Whānau wanted semi-private lounges, so I just got in at a time where they were renovating, so they did that. Whānau wanted a business hub, so they put that in. They already had that at one of their houses, but they weren't sure about the new house and the renovation, so they did that. So what I like, and it's only Auckland, I don't know what the other, there's 3 houses in Auckland, I don't know what the other organisations are like or the houses are like, but definitely there's room to move with Ronald McDonald House Auckland. And I can only compare it to the hospital. And while Te Whare Awhina is at Starship in Lorraine, you'd know more about this, none of my whānau were offered that, which is another option for accommodation. So it's not widely promoted. It is on the website, but you know, when you're in stress, the last thing you want to do is try and get on, and you have to know the name. you know, te wharea whenua, or is that what it's called around here? Yeah. So, what was your question? To be part of that, yeah, maybe. I'll see what he wants me to. I do quite a lot for Ronald McDonald House, and what I love about the CE is that, you know, when he'll ask me to present at a certain function, I'll go, what do you want me to content? He goes, just tell whatever you want. So he's quite open, you know. I could trash them if I wanted to, but I don't need to. But would I approach them? Yeah, probably now that you've said it. Yeah. 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 So when I started this research as well, there were no, as I said, there was no research done on. Now there are about 14, I think, articles, but they're all been commissioned by Ronald McDonald House Global. This one is the only one that stands independently, so I need to publish, and also it's the only one that's Indigenous-led and uses an Indigenous approach. So one of the next steps for me would be looking at other organisations around the world, maybe at one or two, and see what and if their Indigenous input is into their Ronald McDonald houses, and see what they do. Because I need to compare it, yeah, to something.
The question really is, would you do it? Because if you can do it, we can also do it.
Yes. Hello, Karen. Oh my God. Yeah. Would I do it? Yeah, I would. Yeah. Okay. Oh no, you keep your word too. Okay. Yeah. You do. Nice to see you.
That question must have gone. Did you have one, Vanessa?
I was just going to actually make a slightly different suggestion. I think that it's the DHBs that are reviewing their contracts with Ronald McDonald House, is that right? I guess I was going to suggest that you might be better to approach the DHBs directly, because the fact is you've done independent research, and I think that potentially the research might be more powerful if it becomes independent of Ronald McDonald
Yeah.
House.
And that kind of has started happening. A project that Donna and I are on hospital transfers. That's why I looked at you. Am I allowed to say that? They wanted some information around, so we did a hospital transfers project. We looked at, one of the issues that came up was whānau accommodation in Waikato, and so they kind of said, what did you find? We're thinking of maybe putting Ronald McDonald House here, or do we need something else? So what I did is pulled out what I found in regards to whānau accommodation through Ronald McDonald House, and also what we had. So then they put it forward as a business case. So it is kind of, I didn't promote Ronald McDonald House. I just said, these are the limitations, these are the things that whānau expect, this is what Ronald McDonald House Auckland is doing, and they got back to us and said, we're going to put it forward as a business case, this is good information. So yes, all three, yeah.
Okay, well, might call it there, but I just want to, on behalf of everyone, say kia ora and thank you to Rachel for your amazing talk today, and for sharing not only your personal whānau story and all the stories from the whānau that you interviewed, but your reflections on the PhD process and the learnings for the students here. So thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you around the building in the coming weeks.
Thank you.
Kia ora.
That's a good one. Where's Anne?
It was, it's heavy. I just keep thinking, man, that is heavy. But I love the way you keep looking at your data and going, actually, there's more to this.
Yeah, there is way more, but I could only kind of skim.
Right. Looks like you just
Hi.
I'm Anne from House.
Yes.
Wayne was ringing to see whether it would be right if we came
Oh,
along.
God, I have a...
No, so we were just sorry we didn't get a chance to let you know we were here before we turned up, but we were just thinking that we should say no, and some of those issues around the DHBs and things maybe we should talk about.
We felt it was really, but no, I'm Deb.
Deb's our head of fundraising and marketing, so.
I thought I recognised that.
and we're very fortunate we've got people, families like you who stay with us, who really value and know that the association with Papuans is actually just part and parcel. It's not defining and certainly doesn't influence how we services.
No.
It's really important today, and we can, and I know ways to into a couple of years ago, and now certainly
In fact, some of the findings from your thesis would be actually been really interesting for some of our team, our family support staff. And we can talk about this somewhere down the track. But if we had an opportunity to get you in the house and get our team together, to cover some of the key things that affect families that we just don't perhaps pick up on enough. And Wayne was also keen to touch base. He's been talking with me. Just around what sort of cultural supports we need, within the organisation as well. So I think he'll be really keen to touch base. He would like to have come himself, but he just couldn't come.
And he just rang as I was walking in.
Oh, did he?
But thank you for coming.
oh, thank you. It's really interesting.
So interesting.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah, and that's only some of it.
Yeah,
It's only kind of
yeah. It's amazing when you can put it into an hour, but
Thanks for putting in your programs to that. This is the innovation. In particular if we go to Waikato, whether the percentage of families is going to be even higher, unfortunately, and I'll need to Thank you very much.
yeah, I mean, maybe despite that one touch, because I know it's not
No, I'm here. I'm actually working here Monday a week. No, I live here, but I work remotely. Because I also did a media thing which picked up on one of the phones. But a similar thing, like I thought was a positive influence.
and we got asked if we wanted to participate in that, and we declined at the time because we actually knew we had got more work to do before it would be a published or review, so we wanted to, that was one of us anyway.
But I'm happy to come in and meet whatever way.
Yeah, that is, yeah.
Because I really love the way you do. And you do a great job.
We're getting there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to an organisation.
You always got to improve, don't you?
Yeah. And you're open.
See,
Yeah.
thank you, so we should stop taking
Nice
this
to
time.
see
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, well done. Okay. So I'll talk to you. You're going to be here for
Yeah.
full time?
No, I'm starting at 1 day a week.
Okay.
So maybe Monday. Where are you? Where's your office?
I'm there to
Okay.
what you're busy.
All right.
So I'll send you an email. You'll be in the system. And then we
Yeah.
get lunch Sunday.
I'm
and
going
we
to
talk.
email you. Yes. Let's do that.
Yeah, anything from next time?
Yeah.
When you're sending
Yeah.
I'll send you an email
Yeah.
once the email is done.
Yeah.
I'll see you soon.
Okay, thanks.
Rachel. Because I saw it pop up on my computer.
I was thinking about you guys.
We'll catch up. Yeah. No way. You reckon? I couldn't read. People were like,
oh, I could have sat there and listened to you all day. Because almost everything you described relates to our experience with my borders and scholarship. But it's still the same now. And then the other thing is, more recently I've been helping my uncle navigate secondary services out at Middlemore.
yeah,
And exactly the same experience. Not directly for a child, but I think the same principles apply for pretty much all Māori whānau that go in for secondary services. And the part I thought was really interesting is that almost every week the DHB hassle me about being on some specialty equity group to address an issue like, for example, immunisation or something stupid like that, right? And they come to the brown faces for the equity issue like it's our problem, but actually they're the problem.
Yeah.
And then when you let them know that actually the issue is what are you going to do about it, they think you've